Hello, I'm Valerie Piet, and this is IOHR TV. Professor Guy Berger is the global voice of press freedom. As UNESCO Director for Freedom of Expression and Media Development, he's responsible for press freedom, safety of journalists, ensuring media independence, internet freedom, information literacy, and journalism education around the world. It's a very wide and incredibly important remit. Before joining UNESCO, Guy headed the School of Journalism and Media Studies at Rhodes University in South Africa. Guy Berger, thank you so much for joining us on IOHR TV. In the Philippines, Maria Ressa, the editor-in-chief of Rappler, is once again facing jail for standing up to censorship of the press. What can be done to support her fight against 6 years in jail?
Well, the case of Maria Ressa, who's the editor of Rappler, has long been in the news, and UNESCO has been very much involved with Maria, and she's spoken on many of our platforms. And she's been a person who has really been an early victim of disinformation, and a person who's fought back and exposed who's doing the disinformation. So I think the one thing is to do is that civil society can certainly learn from Maria's tenacity and also from her proactivity. And it's an important thing that when journalists are under attack, that it's understood that this comes with the part of the job in some parts of the world, and it's critical that freedom of expression should be protected, and that journalists should be allowed to do their jobs, and that they should not become victims of arbitrary action. They should not become subject to the kinds of attacks that Maria has had, particularly with the misogynistic and violent rhetoric that has been part of her life for the past couple of years.
At the time of global pandemic, the public need to trust the credibility of their news sources. What are some of the main challenges that COVID-19 poses for freedom of expression, in your opinion?
Well, as has often been stated, we have two problems. The one is the pandemic, and the other one is the disinfodemic, which is the combination of misinformation and disinformation. And so you've got a huge challenge in combating the pandemic because of the problems in the information sphere. And these problems come out of ignorance, they come out of malice, they come out of good intentions, but with disregard for real verification or science. They also come sometimes because there are actions that are being implemented by the authorities, which mean that there's less information coming than that should be coming in terms of transparency of what government is doing, where the money is going, why there's been a failure in many cases to prepare properly. So this is quite a difficult situation because really at a time of crisis like this, first of all the health crisis, but then all the associated crises, it's really a vital thing that the public has got access to quality information, which is the kind of information that a lot of media do produce. Not all media, but most media that's in the public domain, and journalists are doing this. And that media needs to be able to do this job, because if they can't do it now, all kinds of delays will happen, diversions, distractions from how humanity can find its way through this health crisis and all the associated crises that are coming in its wake.
What do you think UNESCO as an organization can do to help tackle some of those challenges?
Well, UNESCO works in the UN system, particularly with media, and so we've been trying to highlight the important role that media does play. And we've been pointing out that most of the disinformation is being distributed without any check or balance or counter on social media. We've been trying to persuade governments that much as many don't like independent media, it's better the devil you know than the kind of misinformation and disinformation that is being disseminated, for example, on WhatsApp. And we've also been discussing with the internet companies the need for them to become much more transparent about what is the situation in the transmission of this misinformation and disinformation. And we are also working with other colleagues in the UN to say, what can we learn from combating disinformation on this issue, in the disinfodemic, that is relevant to disinformation in elections, in climate change, on gender issues, all the other kinds of areas that we need to really encourage quality information.
The spread of disinformation is putting pressure on the ability of journalists to report on issues and events, gather the facts and look at the perspectives. Having headed the School of Journalism in South Africa, what impact do you think that pressure will have on journalists in the long term?
Even public service media has been struggling to get the kind of resources it needs from public funds. But when you're speaking about commercial media, unless you're really big, like the New York Times, you're facing a very, very tough situation. Journalists are losing their jobs. Community media is really lost legs in some parts of the world. Some magazines are closing down. And so people say it's like an extinction event, and some of us won't come back even when economies improve. So this is not a good scenario for the world. It's certainly not a good scenario for young people who want to become journalists. And so I think those who are concerned about the future of journalism have to start thinking about what kinds of models could work, and that means a slightly different kind of journalism. First of all, it means having a relationship where people will pay something, a membership fee or a subscription fee, even if they're poor. So you've got to do journalism that really, really meets their interests, where they feel there's value for that. And at the same time, you have to have institutions with enough independence and transparency that can channel certain kinds of subsidies to media institutions as public services.
We've seen many so-called anti-fake news laws being used instead to stifle freedom of expression. Do you think there are any effective legislative options for governments to prevent the spread of misinformation? What happens next?
Well, the one thing that has not been coming forward so much, but could come more forward, is for legislation that would require the internet companies to be more transparent. I think that would make a big difference. Now, in some cases, in most cases, these laws are very, very vague, which means that they can, even if not intended as such, they can be used to selectively target individuals with whom the government has a difference. What we have been encouraging at UNESCO is far more, I suppose, enabling and empowering legislation, for example, to develop regulations to have media and information literacy really institutionalized in schools and colleges, for regulation policies that will support independent journalism, because we think those in the end are going to be more effective in trying to outlaw something that's pretty difficult to pin down, particularly when you're speaking about an issue like COVID, where some things we do know are true, some things we do know are false, but there's a lot in the middle that we don't know about yet. And so when you're trying to legislate and you've got this gray area, intrinsically you sit with the problem.
In many countries, distrust in mainstream media is increasing, and many turn instead to alternative media sources that may promote false facts. How can trust in media be increased?
I think we need to quite carefully scrutinize this commonly stated assertion that there's a declining trust in media, because there's increased trust in some media and decreased in other media. But it is the case that we want media to be even more broadly trustworthy than just trustworthy for those who feel that their worldview is being reinforced. And for that, we really need journalism that's first of all, super accurate, verifies everything, is not taken, is not hoaxed, not taken for a ride. And finally, I'd say we need journalists who are far more conscious of their own perspectives and biases. I don't mean narrow political biases, I mean more their worldviews, so that they can actually begin to resonate with audiences that have got different experiences to them.
Do you think the responses we're seeing from platforms such as Twitter and Facebook to control malinformation is effective?
Certainly, these internet companies have done a lot more than they have done previously. It's difficult to know how effective it is because we don't know the full and ongoing scale. So, for example, we are told that certain content has been removed, certain content has been labeled, but we're not told what was the circulation of that content beforehand. We're not told whether the people who were exposed to that content were then exposed to fact-checking corrections. So there's still a lot more that these internet companies can do. And I think they also need to come forward and say, are they tweaking their algorithms? Because it seems that many of their algorithms are really pushing level of disinformation, not through any malice or love of disinformation, but simply because this is stuff that's easy to grab attention, and these companies are in the attention business because they want data. So, we certainly think that they're doing something, they're doing more, but they're not doing enough.
The European Commission recently proposed a set of new actions aimed at tackling disinformation. Among other things, the Commission stated that online platforms should provide monthly reports to include more detail linked to their actions to promote authoritative content, improve users' awareness, and limit coronavirus disinformation and advertising related to it. What do you think about that? More generally, what responsibilities do those online platforms have to prevent the spread of disinformation?
Well, we are at a time in the world where traditional norms of freedom of expression are under great challenge. Not simply that some states are falling beneath them, but there's some political actors who are throwing out the norms altogether. So you're having a confusing situation. And then when you come into the disinformation realm, that itself is being weaponized. So, many politicians who are in many respects proponents of disinformation and misinformation, but then call out media as being fake news. So it's a difficult time where we've got to try and, I think, hold the norms that freedom of expression is not only a fundamental right, it's also recognized by the Sustainable Development Goals, and it's key to overcoming crises. It's key to exposing corruption. It's key to educating people. It's key to accountability. All the interventions against disinformation should not be worse than what they're trying to cure. And so we have to live with pluralism. We have to embrace the contestation of ideas, but at the same time, when there's incitement to violence, when there's fraud being perpetuated, such as buy my snake oil and cure you of COVID, those kinds of things really, the legal action needs to be taken there. But we've got to get governments to realize that legal responses are extremely complex and ridden with potential problems, and that there are a lot of other responses that could be far better.
In the UK, the 2018 Commission on Fake News and Teaching of Critical Literacy Skills found that only 2% of children have the skills needed to identify a news story. So-called fake news is driving a culture of fear, anxiety, and distrust among pupils. How do we best promote media and information literacy?
Well, this media and information literacy definitely needs to be in schools, but it's a wider question than schools because a lot of it is actually being spread on email, for example, with the older generation. But children, of course, are super important as well, and they're in their learning stages. And children are also in this phase of developing their identities. And that's where disinformation, hate speech, emotional content can really begin to take over their lives. And so instead of being masters of their own identity, being proactive developers of who they are, they become buffeted and shaped by this other stuff that's going on. So it's really critical that at the level of schools, young people are encouraged to understand that, for example, what they think is a free service, which might be Instagram, it might be Snap, it might be YouTube, and so on, that these services are not per se free, that they have a business model, as they need to have a business model, but that has implications for what content is seen, for how people can use the platform, for what policies are on there. And so we need to give young people the kind of mature wisdom about the environment within which communications takes place, and then how they can actually respond and decode and try and verify and try and identify the trusted sources on this wild west of the internet.
We've done a lot to keep up pressure on the Turkish authorities to halt the ongoing abuse of journalists. At their universal peer review in the UN in January, the Turkish ambassador was still branding journalists as terrorists and said that freedom of expression was not an absolute right and did not protect terrorist propaganda, incitement to hatred, or violence. Freedom of expression could be subjected to restrictions as provided for under international human rights treaties. Nothing seems to be changing in Turkey. What can be done to keep up the pressure?
If you're going to restrict freedom of speech, such as against terrorism, it must be through legal means, and therefore the law must be predictable. Therefore, you must be able to have a pretty strict, narrow definition of what is terrorism. You can't just use it for, non-violent acts that are not terrorism. I mean, that's too vague. So you're falling short in that in terms of how you're interpreting legality there. Then you also have necessity and proportionality. And so what are the penalties that are there? So, in some cases, countries have said, well, we're going to block the whole of YouTube because there's one video we don't like. At any rate, you've got to look at proportionality, and then you've got to look at legitimate reason. Is it a legitimate reason in terms of the international standards? So I think in all cases, we've got to uphold the international standards still, because these are standards that have been around a long time. I think they've served humanity well. They are signed up to by almost every government. And then we have to get into the debate about, well, if you say you're following these standards, excellent. Now let's talk about how you're interpreting them. And I think to get into that is at least to keep the norm aloft as the standard, and to try and bring people closer to the standard, rather than as some elements in the world want to do today, which is to throw out these standards altogether.
IOHR has a campaign to free 4 Yemeni journalists sentenced to death by Houthi-controlled court in Sana'a. What is your recommendation on the steps that can be taken to secure their release?
Well, I do think that norms remain important even in those kind of situations, and that norms need to be amplified. And I think that it's critical in a situation like that as well, that people are held accountable to this, and they are told there's no bones are made about the fact that there will be accountability to these standards, and there are different kinds of accountability. But ultimately, we've got to see public opinion as something that's always information. It can be aligned to international norms. It can be whipped up to be against international norms. And so if one sees this thing about public opinion as, I suppose, a medium-term struggle, which one's trying to work on to win the public opinion battle, one has to keep on repeating these things. And even if it doesn't seem that they are producing immediate results, one is holding a line at least. And so I think it's worth it. I think it's important, particularly when others are not just in actions pushing back against these international standards, but also in words. And so, and they certainly know how to use repetition, emotion, and other techniques to advance their cause. So it's disappointing not to see immediate results, but I don't think one can give up. I don't think one's got to try harder and more creatively and enlist as many different points of leverage as possible to, for example, make sure that journalists are not executed.
Last year, we participated in World Press Freedom Day in Ethiopia and held events and workshops with local journalist students. This year, what are your hopes for World Press Freedom Day in The Hague?
World Press Freedom Day in The Hague. So the Netherlands has kindly agreed to host World Press Freedom Day in The Hague, and we had to postpone it because of COVID. And we were looking at hosting it again in October, and now even that date is up for questioning. But I hope there'll be an announcement quite soon about a date in December. If anything, this conference is more important than ever because it's drawing attention after the COVID experience to what is important about journalism and independent and free journalism at this moment in history. And I do think we've got some wonderful examples to show where journalists have, for instance, helped people deal with bereavement at this difficult period, where journalists have exposed security force abuses in enforcing lockdown, where journalists have called out authorities or celebrities for doing disinformation. And let's look at those examples and say, oh, that's fantastic. How can we spread that kind of experience for beyond the COVID period? And how can we also learn from what's happened with the negative developments, the kind of suppression of journalism, expulsions from countries, for example, locking up some journalists over this period, and how can we really make the case that this is one of the most retrograde steps that can be taken during a time of great crisis.
Guy Berger, it's been such a pleasure to have you on IOHR TV, and thank you for your work with UNESCO. I hope that world press freedom around the world will continue to be in such safe hands. I'm Valerie Piet. It's been a pleasure to have you here with us on IOHR TV, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.